back to Safe Space, where life questions are talked about from Christian perspectives. I am speaking to Dr. Sharon Bong on feminism. Last week we spoke about the definitions of feminism, the kinds of feminism, the very dubious phrase feminazis and things like that. Today we're going to talk about Jesus, the Bible, and how, if at all, they're related to feminism. Welcome back, Sharon.
Thank you, Alwyn.
So with regards to Jesus and the Bible, do you detect any feminist elements in the way Jesus or the apostles or the Bible characters, in the way they treated and talked about women?
Definitely.
Definitely.
From the point of view of feminist theologians, and there's so many, okay, from the side of Protestants to Catholic feminist theologians, Jesus is hailed as the first feminist actually in the Bible, in the way that he, treated women. And often they would look on the story of the Samaritan woman, for instance, or the healing of the bent woman, the woman who's hemorrhaging, Jesus's attitude towards, women whom others regarded as fallen, or, prostitutes as they were labeled, or unclean women. And for these reasons, Jesus is hailed as the first feminist in the Bible.
Right, sure. So yes, I now you mentioned the many cases of how Jesus, and I think what you would be referring to would be how Jesus stood up for these people, right? And
yes.
How he moved to dangerously be aligned with them, to resonate with them, when society would have already outcast them.
Exactly,
out, right?
In his time, yes.
In his time. What about the New Testament apart from the Gospels? I mean, in your reading of Paul's letters or the other pieces, do you detect a good case for feminism there in those areas?
I'll just go back very quickly to the Gospels, okay, before I go on to the other bits in the New Testament. And I'm reminded of this because I'm a Catholic. And why do I say that? Because the arguments often used, it may not be exactly answering your question, Alwyn, but the arguments used against the ordination of women within the Catholic Church have been these two, and that is, the focus on the maleness of Christ and the fact that he only had male apostles.
Sure.
But my wanting to go back to the Gospels is the whole resurrection, okay? And that Christ's first witnesses to his resurrection were women. And so that's the other point that feminist theologians make, and that is that because women were the first witnesses of the resurrection of Christ, that they, and also that they had the courage to stand at the foot because of the nature of how Jesus was crucified, that it took tremendous courage just to be seen in public, and to be at the tomb. And in that way, they became the first witnesses of what is the cornerstone of Christianity, the resurrection of Christ.
Do you personally see any significance in the role of Mary towards your feminism?
Yeah, speaking to a Catholic, the
devotion
to
yes.
the devotion to Mary is
right.
what has caused many other Christian denominations to view Catholics as worshipping Mary, for instance.
Sure.
So the devotion to Mary is, I think, unique to the Catholics, and the more you go into the whole study of Mariology, and especially, in South America or even in the Philippines, which is predominantly Christian, that you would find that, well, there are two ideas more or less circulating with regard to Mary. Number one, because she's a woman, and she's seen as someone who intercedes. Okay, she's not God, but there are many other conspiracy theories, if you like, or many other theories that have a different view. And I think the Da Vinci Code captures some of that, and I was just spellbound when I saw that, and the whole, Mary Magdalene coming into it. But anyway, I'm digressing. oh God, I forgot my point. But the second issue that feminists would have with Mary is a more problematic one. And I think this you enjoy, because within the Catholic framework, Mary is hailed as both a virgin and a mother.
Right.
So the contention is that, you know, for a lay woman, how accessible is Mary to the average woman for whom to be a mother, you can't at once be a virgin.
Of course.
Yeah. And the whole construct of Mary as Virgin Mother was believed by feminist theologians to be a very male construct, in that they needed to have a woman who was undefiled, a woman who was pure, because she was a vessel, you know, to be bringing Christ into the world. And so feminist theologians have sort of had a very uneasy, shall we say, relationship with Mary when you put the devotion and everything aside. Yes.
Okay. Thanks. It's true that, well, Jesus' apostles were all guys. I've read before that in Romans, if you read Romans, some of the early apostles of the church, and these are not the top 12 of those kind of. I mean, they were like so-called, for lack of a better word, lay apostles, or many of them were women. And in fact, I think if you read Romans, I think in 14 or 15, you see that Paul lists down a list of women. And so, in essence, when I first learned that, it was actually quite an eye-opener. So there were many apostles. There were many women leaders in the early church. However, and here's the point where I'd like to ask your opinion. What do you think about the patriarchy which is presented in the Bible? Especially in New Testament, there's the very famous 1 Corinthians 14 passage where it supposedly or allegedly tells women to sit down and shut up. That is by Paul. What do you think of verses like those from the New Testament?
Over a year ago, at the lecture, there was a Bible scholar who I think would be able to give you a much more accurate and profound response to that. And he talked about, you know, contextualizing verses like this in its own historical time, as it were. And there are many other problematic verses like this. You know, the other one that is often cited would be, you know, wives submit to husbands, for instance. But for every verse like this that some detractors, shall we say, will you know, hold up to put women in their place, and the thing about putting women in their place is what is key here. There are other verses that feminist theologians would pick up to counter-argue, but essentially, in regard to that particular phrase, I don't have the biblical know-how, but what I want to say is that that should be taken in its own context. Yes, that should be taken in its own context. But the other verse that I cited, the one about, you know, wifely submission, if that were not taken out of context, it also talks about, you know, a mutuality, a relationship of mutuality and interdependency, and also wives submitting to the husbands and children to, I believe, to their parents.
That's right.
Yes. So sometimes, you know, verses like this are taken out of context and, out of the spirit in terms of what it was intended, which is a relationship of loving mutuality, for instance, yes, and not, you know, a case of having dominion or domination one over the other.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you believe that there is some kind of God-given essentialism with regards to humanity? The reason I'm asking is because I suppose the traditional point of view would say that, there is, men are men and women are women, and men are supposed to do this and women are supposed to do this. What is the feminist response to that kind of perspective?
I guess it's already intimated in your question, Alwyn, that of course, a very resounding, of course, it's about biological essentialism.
Sure.
And I must say that in terms of mainstream interpretations of the holy text, and for Catholics, you know, the doctrines and the dogmas of the Church accentuate biological determinism. And it's exactly as you've spelled out that, you know, if you're born male, you ought to be gendered masculine, and if you're born female, you ought to be gendered feminine. Okay. And the two shall not cross. So these are mutually exclusive identities, and of course feminists have a term for that, and we call that dualisms, or, you know, binaries. So these are mutually exclusive categories, which means that a male is not a female is not a male. And when that translates into our daily life, it goes down to how you should dress, you know, compared to how your sister, you know, should dress. It comes down also to the amount of food that you know, sons are given as opposed to daughters, the level of education, the kind of jobs, what is considered proper feminine jobs, you know, proper masculine jobs. So it's played out intergenerationally in very everyday, you know, living in that sense. But it's certainly, you know, gender dualisms or binaries have a lot of resonance and a lot of biblical justification, which is the reason why it's often said that, you know, religion is like the last bastion, because it holds up. It's not just a matter of conservatism, but sometimes, you know, the gender binaries, there is a time and place for it, but often the way it's put into practice in everyday living can have, you know, destructive or can have harmful, I would say, or unhealthy effects, on the sort of socialization of, you know, daughters and sons.
Sure.
Yeah.
But would you say that there are times when it helps to emphasize the difference between the sexes?
Because that gives people a sense of security when, you know, gender identities are seen as stable. Okay. But for those of us in the field, we recognize it as a construct, which means that there's a lot of work that goes into, you know, maintaining it, a lot of gender work that goes into maintaining these hard, you know, hard line distinctions, boundaries. And there's a very real, you know, persecution of individuals who cross over. You know, sometimes quite literally, but, you know, metaphorically as well, to cross over. Sure. Yeah. Okay. So that's where, you know, you'd want to question, where does this sort of severity and, you know, hostility and hate and bigotry, you know, come from? So you want to question that, especially if, you know, people are claiming that these are Christian. Okay, Christian manifestations or Christian behavior, to, you know, to judge, to hate, to condemn, for instance. Yeah.
Thanks, Sharon. So, I mean, so when you, based on your life as a Christian so far, your understanding of the entire Bible, would you say that God has a, what I call a feminine side? Is there a feminine side to you know, the creator of the universe? And what would that feminine side look like? And
for sure. This is not just about the New Testament, but this is also already glimpsed in the Old Testament as well. Right. You know, all the analogies of a hen gathering her chicks, for instance. And there are so many others. So, you know, God is not, the God of the Old Testament is often portrayed like Prometheus, you know, like some, you know,
warrior. And
you know, this guy who's got something, you know, out for everybody and has this destructive capacity and is a God that's so easily angered and everything. But there are all of these feminine rather, images of God. And of course, when we talk about the Trinity, and when you talk about, you know, not to say the feminization of Jesus, but in the way that we spoke of at the start of this segment, Jesus standing on the side of the oppressed, or in solidarity with the marginalized. And because in his time, as it is in our time, so many of the marginalized, you know, are women. They're not exclusively women, but so many, you know, so many of the marginalized are women. So in that sense, not to say the feminine side, but the compassionate side, And I guess the way Jesus held himself up, you know, because as a man, he had very different notions than, you know, the Pharisees or the judges and the men in charge of in his day had. Patriarchal, if you'd like that label, and yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Sharon. That's all for our second segment. To be the first to see our clips, subscribe to us by clicking on the subscribe button below. Share thoughts with us by commenting below. If you have a question for Dr. Sharon, please send it over to host@safespace.my. Come back next week where we'll talk about how to be a Christian feminist in Asia.
Got questions? Connect with us. Send us a tweet or an email.